You imagine that the presumptions that make up our society and stabilize them have a hierarchical structure. And some of them are old and deep. And one of the oldest and deepest would be the idea that men and women alike are made in the image of God. And so that's a very fundamental proposition. And then you might say that, well, the more fundamental a proposition is, the more other propositions depend on it. And then you might say, it's those most fundamental propositions that have to be transmitted from generation to generation. The more peripheral propositions, which are newer, and they would be akin to newer genetic variations in a given organism, the more they're free to vary because not so many things depend on them. And they should vary because their fundamental nature is still up in the air in some sense. But there's a hierarchy of presumptions, and the deeper the presumption, the less it should be amenable to change. I think that can be worked out on the conservative side.
I think so. I think you're describing exactly what I'm describing, just from another field.
Yeah.
By the way, there's this really fascinating passage in Hayek, in Friedrich Hayek, who, the great economist and liberal thinker from the middle of the last century. He argues that there's that the emergence of the picture of science as an evolutionary process by trial and error is the transference of the old common law idea of the law as evolutionary, the Constitution as evolutionary. The transfer of that was completely natural, for English and Scottish thinkers who knew that the law was supposedly evolved this way, to begin thinking in the same way about science as trial and error, and that obviously could easily have inspired Darwin as well.
Well, then we could think about English common law the same way. So English common law, tell me if I've got any of the details of this wrong, but basically under the English system, the presumption is human beings have all the rights there are intrinsically. And then when people come together and have a dispute, the dispute has to be adjudicated. And once it's adjudicated, that becomes a common law principle. And then those principles are supposed to be bound by precedent. And so then the presuppositions in English common law that have the most precedent are the most fundamental. And so it's an incrementally transforming structure, but it's also hierarchically structured. And it differs from, let's say, the French Civil Code. It certainly differs from systems of thought like Marxism, which are all rational creations and imposed from the top down. And so English common law did have this bottom-up nature, which gives it, well, I would say in some sense, a preeminent status among legal codes around the world. It's a remarkable body of work.
Yep, it is. Let me just add, I think your description is apt. Let me just add a couple of points to that. One of them is that the common law is a development coming down the centuries of biblical law. If you go back to the earliest formulations of legal codes in Britain, a lot of it is taken literally, explicitly, directly from law codes in Hebrew Scripture. And a second point that's important is that what you're describing, the jostling among individuals, which then create cases that set precedents, that also happens at the constitutional level, not only at the level of individuals competing with one another, for rights, but also if you look at Magna Carta and the Petition of Right and the English Bill of Rights, and then after that the American Bill of Rights. If you look at that as an ongoing jostling between the executive, which originally the king, and the legislature, which was originally the nobles, and what you see is exactly this kind of trial and error to find the right balance, which literally goes on for 1,000 years. and the Constitution that that the Americans in 1787 took upon themselves, if you compare it to the earlier English Petition of Right and Bill of Rights, you'll see that virtually all of the rights that appear in the American Constitution are actually things that were already worked out over centuries in this trial and error effort to find the right balance in England.
So this means Jefferson is wrong because he didn't, in the manner that you described, that each successive generation is a foreign territory compared to the previous, because he's not taking into account the hierarchical nature of fundamental social presuppositions. And so he might be correct on the fringe and the periphery, but at the core he's wrong. And the case that you're making is that while you have the American constitutional axioms, let's say, including expanded to include the Bill of Rights, but that's grounded in English common law. That's a consequence of centuries of trial and error. It's trial and error in a very particular way, because imagine that you and I have a dispute and we 300 years ago, and we go in front of an English court. The court has to rule in relationship to the dispute in a manner that's commensurate with all previous rulings of that broad type. And then the rulings have to be consistent enough with grounded human intuitions of what constitutes a just settlement, so that when the settlement is handed down, the parties involved actually find it acceptable enough not to degenerate into murder.
That's super well said. I think that's exactly the point. And if you now want to ask, let's say that we go with Jefferson for a moment, and we say, actually, using reason, like we can just come up with what the right answer is in the 1700s. We don't need the 800 years of trial and error before that. If you go with Jefferson, where you end up is with a view that says, look, I exercised reason. I don't need tradition because I can exercise reason. I don't need an inheritance of ideas and principles and precedents because I can just use reason. If you go in that direction, what happens is that even though your intentions are liberal and not Marxist, your intention is just to allow people to be free of previous generations. That's all, to think for themselves. If you do that, then what you will come up with is something that it runs down. It actively, aggressively runs down the inheritance of common sense and precedents and intuitions that people have gotten.
Well,
and then you end up with,
what is this logic? What is this reason that the liberals are stressing precisely? I mean, if you investigate that from a psychological perspective, I mean, you could think about it as the application of pure logic, but that's foolish because people just aren't that logical, and very few people are trained to think logically in any case. And then with regards to reason itself, unless you're a radical empiricist and you believe that the pathway forward and the guardrails are self-evident as a consequence of exposure to the facts, which is naive beyond belief, then your reason is an empty concept. Because, I mean, if we're reasoning with language, let's say, which would be the most reasonable way of reasoning, because you can communicate with other people that way. Every single bloody word you use was crafted by other people. Every phrase has a history. Every sentence is a fragment of a philosophical tradition. And then every profound idea is very unlikely to be original. And so the very tools of reason itself are established by, not only by tradition, but by an unbelievably profound hierarchical consensus, because you and I couldn't even speak unless almost everything we said to each other was comprehensible because of our shared set of assumptions. Again, we can play on the fringes, right? I mean, as long as we're 99% in agreement, we can talk about the 1% where we differ and we can nibble away at the edges. But if we were radically different in our orientation and our individual reason, we couldn't even talk.
Right. By the way, this point is already made explicitly by Selden, John Selden, the great common lawyer and constitutional scholar, in the early 1600s, that every single word that we use is something that was crafted by previous generations, and that's the basis for our capacity to be able to live together. Now, to go back to your a question that you started with, if you have a society that has a common inheritance. Okay, now I'm not saying that everybody has to agree on everything, but there is exactly, as you said, there's an inheritance in which 90% or 95% or 98% of what we think has been inherited, and we agree on it, and then we argue, as you say, on the fringes. That is a very good description of a successful, cohesive polity in which there are competing parties, in which there are, you can have democratic votes, you can have transitions from the rule of one party to another, but all of this depends on a mutual recognition among the different parties that they're part of one inheritance, and that they're willing to honor one another, because even though they disagree, they may hate each other, but they understand that they're part of one structure, as you said, one inherited logic. And what we've done today is to say, no, we don't need any of that.
Yeah.
We don't need any of that. It doesn't matter how much of it you uproot and throw out, because we trust the new human reason that the revolutionaries are going to come up with to be something better than what we inherited.